Hello, everyone, and welcome to this second day of this virtual conference on sustainable and scalable mini-grid business models that is organized by the African School of Regulation, the ASR, in collaboration with the African Development Bank, the Africa Forum for Energy Utility Regulators, the Association for African Mini-Grid Developers Association, AMDA, Global Energy Alliance for the People and the Planet, GIAP, and IRENA, the Renewable International Agency, with participation of experts from different organizations. I am Ignacio Pérez Arriaga. I am the interim director of the African School of Regulation. And just for the benefit of those who were not present yesterday, I will review very quickly some practical matters. First of all, this is a special kind of conference. So today we will have only panels with no PowerPoint presentations, just dialogue that will be guided by a moderator that will be also an active participant in the sessions. And we will have a few people as panelists so that they could interact and go around the topics as they see that is convenient. We have two groups of participants. One is the speakers in the different sessions that will be able to speak. And then the second group that you will be muted, but you will be able to write in the chat box and ask Q&A questions. If we can handle that, we will try to answer those questions in writing at the moment. I will be asking also the panelists to take a look at the end of the session to see if they can help us in answering the questions that are addressed to you, or even other questions that are addressed in general. And otherwise, offline, the team of the ASR will be answering these questions. There is translation from English to French only, not vice versa, because all the speakers are able to speak English, even if it is not their first language. The conference is being recorded, and all the speakers have received an agreement to know that this is going to be recorded and to agree with it. And then the sessions, the moderator will make an initial statement, typically below 5 minutes, and then the same with each one of the speakers, and they will engage in conversation. So I think this is all regarding the practical matters. Then day two, I would say, is the important day in the sense that yesterday we were discussing the current situation of the mini-grid sector and different types of experiences. So we know what the difficulties are and the successes and failures are. Today, we are focusing on the challenges and solutions to the problems that were identified yesterday. And for that, we will have 3 panel sessions. The first one will be on the regulatory topics, regulation, focusing on the sustainability of the business models for mini-grids. The second one will be focusing on scalability, although scalability and sustainability are very closely interrelated. And the third one will be looking at the practicality of how it is possible that the principles that we have discussed in the first 2 other panels could be implemented. But you can see that the 3 sessions overlap a lot, which I think is very good because the topic is complex and has many different perspectives. And with that, I finish my introduction within the 5 minutes. And then the panelists for panel 3, regulation for inclusive and sustainable mini-grids, have the word and the floor. So James Sherwood will be the moderator for this panel. Regarding the bios and photos and the background for each one of the participants, you have that in the website of the ASR, and therefore we will not spend a lengthy amount of time with introductions. Thank you, and James, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ignacio, and thank you everyone for joining today. Also, huge thanks to Ignacio and team for organizing this fantastic conference, and also for setting us up to not have to use PowerPoint. So we're looking forward to a great discussion here today. As Ignacio said, this first panel is on regulation for inclusive and sustainable mini grids. And really what that means is regulation that enables the sustainable deployment of mini grids that are needed to achieve the complete electrification of a country according to a broader plan. It's probably fair to say that everyone in this conference shares the goal of complete electrification. And given the topic of this conference, it's probably also safe to assume that we all see a role for mini grids in that fully electrified future. So on this panel, we'll discuss and debate how regulatory policy can ensure that those mini grids are scalable and sustainable over time. This isn't a question of how we enable just a handful of mini grids over in a small part of the country, but how we quickly reach scale on the thousands in a sustainable way. As Ignacio said, I'm James Sherwood, Director for Research and Innovation for RMI's Global South program. I'm going to be joined on this panel by Carolina Barreto, Energy Access Director for Tetra Tech, James Manda, Technical Manager at the Africa Forum for Utility Regulators, and Dan Croft, Manager for Infrastructure at the International Finance Corporation. We'll broadly structure this conversation around 4 questions. First off, what does remuneration look like to enable sustainability? Does this mean cost-reflective tariffs in perpetuity, or are there other options to consider? Second, should mini-grid customers bear fully cost-reflective tariffs, or should tariffs be subsidized or cross-subsidized across customers for similar service? So, for example, should rural customers served by mini-grids have their rates cross-subsidized by urban customers who have benefited from government grid investment? Third, what level of government planning and direction is needed to ensure sustainability? Does this mean setting up and implementing a highly prescriptive plan and responsibility for financing, or setting clear regulatory policy and more or less getting out of the way? And fourth, finally, given the diversity of situations that exist in the real world, how flexible or prescriptive does that policy need to be? To get us started, I'll just share a couple of thoughts from our experience at RMI, and then we'll go around the room and share perspectives from the other panelists. So a couple of things that really jump out to me in thinking about this topic. First of all, the importance of regulatory certainty. This is true around the world. This isn't an Africa-specific issue or a mini-grid specific issue, but global and local economies are unpredictable enough as it is. And so for investors and private sector businesses to be able to operate effectively, need to know that policies are going to more or less stay in place and they're not going to be uprooted overnight. Otherwise, there are plenty of other places that they can take their talents and money. So first and foremost, regulatory certainty. But second, also the value of a more open-ended policy that's centered around a set of clear principles to enable the private sector and utilities to innovate and do what they do best. One example from our experience of this is in Nigeria, where a combination of very clear regulation for mini grids that hasn't changed since it was implemented in 2016, and a government policy of willing buyer, willing seller has enabled the sector to get creative and think about different business models that can serve a variety of different needs, with the understanding that that policy is not going to change in the near term. So this has allowed discos, developers to create models that range from rural interconnected mini grids to more urban and commercial and industrial focused models. So with that, I'll close my opening remarks here and we'll go around the room. So we'll start with Carolina Barreto from Tetra Tech, and then we'll go to James Manda and Dan Croft. Carolina, over to you.
Thank you, James. I would say that the first reaction is that the word perpetuity. I think for anything, you know, that word is complicated and hard to commit to. But I agree with you 100%, right? We need very clear rules of the game, right? For at least a sustainable, you know, timeline. And I would say, you know, when or until when, right? Can we keep a cost-reflective tariff? You know, at the very minimum, right? Investors want returns. So that's a simple answer. What's not simple, right, is who's gonna pay for it. And I think there's an interesting multiple models. James, you just mentioned Nigeria, right? And cost-reflective tariffs doesn't necessarily have to mean, you know, consumer-facing. I mean, we can integrate multiple tools, right? To you know, I'm moving ahead to your next questions, but yes, to bring subsidies, to bring instruments, right? That can support you know, the cost reflective tariffs, depending on, you know, on how expensive they are as well, and how remote these areas are, etc. So there's multiple mechanism, right, from direct rural electrification fund, you know, subsidies, to guarantees, to grants, state grants, and so on. Oh, apparently people are not hearing me well, so.
I can hear
I hear you fine,
very
Gary.
well from Spain, so I think go ahead. It's not your problem.
We can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay, good. So, so I'll stop here, and yeah, just to mention that we'll continue, I guess, going into the details with the rest of your questions. But I think you know, there are instruments out there. There are good examples. You mentioned Nigeria. I think Sierra Leone is another one where we have multiple grant facilities, subsidies coming into play, so that you know, those investments can have returns, and we can continue to scale the solutions. Over to you, James.
Fantastic. Thank you, Carolina, and excited to get into many more of those examples as we dig in here. I'll hand it to James Manda to also share opening thoughts. And James, I think I heard or saw you
Thank
talking,
you.
but you're on mute. There we go.
Sorry, I was muted, so apologies for that. So thank you very much. I think I'm going to lean towards the implementation of cost-reflective tariffs in order to accelerate the development of mini-grids, especially in rural areas of Africa. So to begin with, I think I want to speak about why tariff tools are important. And I'm talking about this because the African Forum for Utility Regulators has developed a tariff tool. So I want to mention the fact why those tariff tools in any jurisdiction, why they're important. So the biggest challenge, as we already know, in scaling up mini-grid development is the tariff itself. That is what has hampered most of the developments in Africa. So we know that developers need tariffs to get funding as investors consider cash flows from these tariffs in making investment decisions. The tools essentially give tariff viability and confidence to the developers and investors. So we cannot overgloss that one. Now, tariff tools are also essential to speed up tariff approval processes. Yesterday, we learned that the approval process from regulators can be very cumbersome and it takes long. I think there was a number mentioned about 58 weeks by AMDA, I think. Now that is worrying because we want to shorten this period. Now, if you've got a tariff tool in place, it becomes easier. First of all, if you've got a tariff tool in place and it is understood by all parties, so the developers, the financiers, and the regulators and the government, if they have understood the composition of that tariff tool, it becomes very easy to approve a project because you do not have to guess. Because here's what happens most of the times. The developer comes with their own tariff framework. The regulator does not understand that tariff framework. They have to spend a lot of time teaching the regulators the requirements of that tariff framework. So we recognized that shortfall from the African Forum for Utility Regulators, and we decided, therefore, that let us formulate a tool through consensus, which can be understood by all participants and approach the development of mini grids with a tool that everybody understands. And I think just to continue my discussion, why tariff tools are important before we even go to what we have formed ourselves. The tariff tools, they essentially show the viability gap, okay? And also the question of subsidies. It is required, subsidies are required to bridge the gap between the cost-reflective tariffs and any other tariff. Now, maybe we will discuss who provides the subsidy. It could be, it could be funded by cooperating partners, donors. It could be funded by governments. It could be cross-subsidization between customers, customer categories, different customer categories, and so on and so forth. But what is important is to note that any tariff tool that is formulated to aid the development of mini grids in Africa especially, I'm leaning towards Africa, will require, it is essentially much higher than the utility tariffs. So there is a need, an absolute need, that a subsidy mechanism is worked out, which can help the indigent in society. We talked yesterday about the fact that once a development has taken place in terms of mini grids, we must identify customers who are business oriented and so on and so forth, who can be anchor customers. But those will be few in number. The majority of the customers will just be ordinary people. And so how do we cater for those indigent customers in order to uplift their lot? So these are my preliminary thoughts on why tariff tools are important. Thank you.
Thank you, James. There's a lot for us to follow up on there in the subsequent questions. So great opening remarks here. And over to Dan.
Thanks, James. Hello, everybody. I think when I was thinking about how to open this, it's probably just worth noting that everybody, the sector comprises many, many stakeholders who are all trying to solve the same problem from different angles. So I think from the perspective of IFC, I just sort of wanted to start by noting that we come at this really very much trying to build a pipeline of investable opportunities. It's nuanced by the fact that we're looking to promote private sector development, but that our shareholders are governments. And we're fine with that. We're very comfortable with that, because the most bankable deals for ourselves and other investors are those which are fair and balanced to both sides. So having said that, the wider issue, of course, is that access in Africa is a priority for the whole of the World Bank Group, and we're working very hard with our bank colleagues to promote distributed generation and to improve access levels. They will approach this often from the perspective of sector planning, least cost generation plans, clear electrification strategies, and capacity building, all of which is very, very important. From our side, looking at this as a potential investor, we break things down into categories of risk, because that's what we do. Operational risks, developer credibility and technology performance, and that's really for us to take. And commercial risks, such as demand, willingness to pay, those have to be managed, but they're a reality. And I think the answer is just to do as much due diligence as you can. Political risk, of course, and there are products available in the market. But the focus of this is really regulatory risk, such as grid encroachments, tariff changes. It isn't just about tariffs, of course. It's very important, tariffs, but there's also things like grid encroachment and things like that. Just endorse what James said in his opening remarks about the huge importance of certainty and transparency of regulatory frameworks. Really, investment can't happen without that. You need that to attract private sector developers, and you need that to leverage commercial finance at the scale that's necessary for the sector to take off. Our approach to this has been to note that there was a trickle of opportunities coming to us for financing, nowhere near enough to get to achieve the SDGs. And so we actually, a couple of years ago, stepped back and designed our own approach to mini grids. It's not something that everybody has to accept wholesale. It's a toolkit, it's open source, it's on a website there. Anyone can go and have a look at this. But the slightly ambitious objective of it is to scale up the entire mini grid market in sub-Saharan Africa. We want to create that market. It's a set of programmatic project preparation standards and tools and transaction documents, coupled with associated financial credit enhancement products and risk mitigation instruments to facilitate and support the acceleration of scaling up of private investment. Now, the reason I say this is because this is a session on regulation. And what we tend to find is that there is sometimes, well, usually there's some kind of regulatory framework, but it's very rarely complete. And even where it is, it hasn't been in operation for long enough for anyone to take confidence that it's not going to change. So what we've really adopted is at the heart of our initiative, this Scaling Minigrid initiative, is a template contractual structure. And at the center of that is a concession agreement. So it's reasonably prescriptive in terms of the overall high-level approach, but there is significant flexibility in the document to accommodate whatever local on-the-ground regulation is already there. Central to that structure is a governmental authority who plays the role of the grantor and is authorized and empowered to enforce principles that are agreed upon up front, including how to approach the main regulatory risks. So tariffs, grid encroachment, exclusivity, land rights, permitting, all of this falls into the regulatory regime, of course, in a fair and balanced way to ensure sustainability. And I wanted to start with this because our approach to the regulatory framework is actually regulation by contract. It's not a new approach. I'm not claiming any kind of ownership of it. It's how the IPP market developed across the African continent. But it's critical because we're impatient, others are impatient, and we don't have time to wait for the regulatory frameworks to be developed in full. So what we do is we've come up with something which can plug the gaps. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Dan. And thanks everyone. Great opening remarks. And we have a lot to dig into. And I'm already seeing a lot of overlapping thoughts here when it comes to the importance of having some standardized tools and toolkits that regulators can apply to these challenges. And the regulation by contract bit, I think, is going to be particularly interesting to dig into here at the end when we think about flexibility. But great. Well, to bring us back to the opening question. So first up, let's dig into this question of remuneration and cost reflective tariffs. And Carolina, you made the comment that cost reflective, but to whom, is a great way to think about this. And so opening this up, so the question again, what does remuneration look like to enable sustainability? Are we talking about cost reflective tariffs in perpetuity or for some long period of time, since perpetuity is a very long time? Or are there other options? But really at the end of the day, does this mean cost reflective? How do we think about cost reflective?
Yes, thanks, James. I think for what we see in the sector, the sector, I believe, has come to the conclusion. I do have to say, 6-7 years ago, I was based in Nairobi, and fighting for a bottom-up approach, and the private sector can do it all, government get out of the way, and 7 years later, we're here, right? The sector is maturing. We're coming to the conclusion that we do need subsidies for the sector. I mean, yeah, the sector tried really hard, and I think there's still interesting models. I like what James mentioned, right? With we're coming to a side, we're looking for the anchor load, to make this work, and a lot of private sector developers are now bringing that anchor load to make this work, right? And testing productive use of electricity, and trying to find those alternative sources to make this cost reflective tariff work, right? So I mean, the developer needs to, again, the investor needs to get the returns, so and end of the story. Otherwise, there's no private sector coming in, right? And then it's really about, what is in place, right, in the country, right? So, and how we make those capitals flow, right? So in many cases, regulation, and it's not necessarily an energy sector regulation. It could be the financial sector regulation that doesn't allow, for example, a rural electrification fund that is already in place, and the rural electrification agency is getting, funding. The fund is getting collected through billing, through the national grid, but there is not a framework, right, for the capital to flow from the government to the private sector, right? There's only a framework for that capital flow to the national-owned utilities, government-owned utilities, right? And that's, some of the aspects that, we need to work on, so that again, this subsidized tariff that we know we need for electrification. Again, this is nothing new. This is something, you mentioned it, James, right? Something that has been needed. Rural electrification is subsidized globally. It's not an Africa specific, aspect. You're talking about millions of low income customers, right? And that is not also a mini-grid problem either, right? Like utilities have the same issue. The production cost is at 20 cents, higher than the lifeline social tariff that they are charging those customers. So again, I think a lot of it will have to do with finding ways, right, for those that are already existing mechanisms where that capitals are being gathered, right, so that the cross subsidization can happen. So I'll stop here and give the floor to others.
Thanks, Carolina. Great thoughts. I'll just jump in to say it's a good point that you raised about that this isn't necessarily a tariff or a cross subsidization of tariffs. It could be cross subsidization through other means. So your example, the Rural Electrification Fund, is a really interesting one, and thinking about how those types of funds could flow to the private sector in a way that they're not doing today. I'm curious, James Manda, Dan Croft, any reactions to that, or other thoughts on where that subsidy can come from? Or do you agree that subsidies are basically a prerequisite at this point?
Okay, so thanks for that question. Like I said in my opening remarks, I think subsidies are an absolute necessity because of the levels of the numbers, the quantum of people that that cannot afford the cost-effective tariffs. Now, let me speak about the fact that who provides this tariff? Who provides this subsidy? Where can it come from? First of all, governments are more interested on the levels of tariffs than the tariff 2 per se, like I said. And it is therefore important to get governments buy-in for all these tools that we're describing, okay? Tariffs also, in African perspective, for example, need to be politically acceptable, okay? So cost-effective tariffs may be too high and financially and they could be financially workable if a subsidy is introduced. Now, who provides the subsidy? A lot of governments in Africa have introduced what they call the Rural Electrification authorities. I know of a number of countries that have got the rural electrification authorities in place. And I think going forward, we need to speak to governments to increase funding, because essentially it's the governments that have set up the rural electrification authorities. So we need to have conversations with governments to increase the funding to rural electrification authorities so that the level of the subsidy could be significant. What happens in most cases is that the national tariff is always compared to the tariff that is being charged by through the mini-grid developments, for example. So there's very little consideration that is placed on, for example, the continuity of supply, the safety issues, and so on and so forth. All that they want is to compare what the national utility charges, irrespective of whether there's load shedding or load management or interruptions. Or what people care for is to compare the two. They would usually say we are paying more than our colleagues that are connected to the national grid. And this brings me to the point of what happens to when the grid arrives, because people always compare the two tariffs, and they will agitate for the arrival of the national utility facilities. So if we have to make, if the development of mini grids has to be viable, especially in the rural areas of Africa, and a subsidy is an absolute necessity. And my suggestion would be that governments can increase funding to the rural electrification authorities, who in turn can seek funding from different sources. For example, donors or cooperatives or whatever it may be, to increase their funding levels so that they can relieve the people who are intended to be served through these mini-grid developments. I'll stop here for now.
Thanks, James. That's a great point. And, particularly take your point that if a customer is being served under a mini grid at a higher tariff, they're obviously going to be very eager for a lower grid tariff to show up, or if the grid does become available, they're going to be eager to switch onto that. So there is kind of a built-in momentum for something that's more cost reflective across customer types. But Dan, I'm curious your perspective from the IFC and as an investor. Does any of this talk of subsidy and the role of government within that, does any of that make you nervous, given some of the risks that you flagged that you're considering and the best practices that you and IFC have put out?
I wouldn't say nervous, aware. So it just has to be addressed. It's a reality, and tariff affordability. James made the point that it's got to be politically acceptable. So it's just something that has to be addressed. I think it's worth, if you look at I was trained as a lawyer, so I always look at the wording of these questions and try and answer pretty exactly. But let me not get tied down in detail. But if we're talking about cost reflectivity, you've got to think right up front about the cost. So Carolina mentioned that everyone sort of jumped in thinking, great, the private sector can do this, no need for government, get out of the way, all those things. And now everybody, it was clear that some sort of subsidy was required. Well, the minute you have subsidy upfront on day one, any kind of viability gap funding, it's not cost reflective. And it's not cost reflective on the first day, so it can't be cost reflective in perpetuity, because on day one it isn't. And that's fine. I think the program notes mentioned that, shouldn't be considered a taboo. I'll come on to what I mean by that in a minute, but the question is how to determine the cost. It's difficult. It's really hard to get that right because you don't know until you know and until you've signed a contract what somebody could have done it for. We therefore fully believe that there should be an element of competition because my costs are not your costs, and that it should be the lowest costs that are reflected in the tariff. So that's why, I mean, our program, as you probably know, is built around a tender model. We have a minimum sort of opening tariff so that the government gives an indication of what's affordable in the tender documents, and then bidders bid against a minimum subsidy that they get. And we think that that's the best way to determine, it's not perfect, but it's the best way to determine how little subsidy they could get away with, which gets you as close as possible to cost reflectivity. And our concession then allows flexibility for future tariff adjustments, pass-through of costs, et cetera, and that's to try and address the question that Ricardo Rodolfi asks in the chat. You know, how do you address the issue that regulators routinely don't recognize all the costs because they're also mindful of the political necessity for affordable tariffs? Well, we do it by setting a tariff recognition mechanism in the contract. So we're back to that principle of regulation by contract again. Just final note on the point about the necessity of subsidies. Grid-connected customers continue to receive direct subsidies in the form of lifeline tariffs in many countries. And there's a long history, this is often forgotten, there's a long history of indirect subsidy because a lot of governments way back in time inherited fully depreciated generating assets that were grid connected and then proceeded to charge tariffs that were based on the ongoing operating costs. The problem that the mini-grid sector faces is that you've got all of that upfront capex. So, James said there's this human need to compare. Am I paying more than that person or this person? Well, you never will because your tariff somehow has to accommodate the cost of entirely new capex that wasn't there before. There's whole new infrastructure that just wasn't there. Whereas for a lot of urban grid-connected customers, they're getting the implicit subsidy by only having to cover the operating costs. And we know where that leads. Just have a look at South Africa now, right? If you don't invest in future capex, that's what happens to your grid. Last point, maybe subsidy can be really quite creative. It doesn't just have to be cash. One of the things we're working on as part of the Scaling Minigrid program with they're not Rockefeller, are they anymore, GAP, but we've worked with them to design a minimum revenue guarantee with concessional funding. Now, because that de-risks the projects for investors, it reduces the cost of capital. And once you reduce the cost of capital, you reduce the cost, and therefore cost reflective is a lower number. Lots and lots of different ways to be creative about how you subsidize tariffs. And let me stop there.
Fantastic. Great points, Dan. And I want to pick up on where one of your threads was leading here around getting into that balance between on-grid customers and off-grid customers or customers that are served by a mini-grid. So to your point, there are lots of mechanisms out there to reduce the cost, minimize the cost, whether that's through subsidy or other interventions. But once we get to that lowest possible cost number, to your point about fully depreciated assets make up the bulk of what's serving the grid, and operating costs are going to be relatively low. So when we think about that future, does that mean that we should be thinking about on-grid customers subsidizing the tariffs of mini-grid customers? Should there be a general rider, for example, that's applied on on-grid customers that equalizes or equilibrates the two tariffs, given a regulatory principle of equity across customer groups? Or to James Manda's point, is political acceptability and government buy-in, is that just not going to happen? Is that not a realistic potential outcome? So I'd love to hear thoughts on that.
Mine, James, or have you come back to me, or?
Oh, and any of the above. If you have immediate thoughts, though, go ahead, Dan.
I do. I mean, I think you're never going to succeed in getting a direct subsidy from grid-connected customers. I mean, if you say this is what you're paying extra to subsidize a bunch of people that don't have power yet, you can get there another way. You don't have to be quite so blatant about it. Certainly, one suggestion I would make if I was, I mean, this is a policy decision and I'm not a politician, but I would remove the lifeline subsidy for those people, I would do it on the basis of an ability to pay. I wouldn't do it on a blanket basis. Not politically that easy to do, I grant you, but certainly if you're thinking about the urban, better off, middle class, to coin a phrase, connected customer, you look at how much they're consuming. These are the people that don't really need the lifeline tariff. You can't apply a lifeline tariff to new infrastructure on mini grids because the numbers would it would become unaffordable straight away. But what you can do is you can remove it and pool the money that you're saving and try to find a way of plowing that back into the access, new connections through off-grid solutions. You can do that much more effectively.
Yeah, I mean, it exists, James. Many countries do it. It's not, the the greatest. Not every urban customer goes into their bill and starts breaking down what they're necessarily paying for. But it exists. I think the main issue there is more like the transparency of the mechanism, right? So once the utility collects that fund, how's the cash flowing, and is it truly, going towards investment of rural infrastructure and maintenance of the assets. So I think the main issue with that mechanism is more around the transparency than anything else. But many countries, not only in the continent, but around other continents, have already in place those mechanisms. The main issue, as well as I mentioned previously, is that they are that type of cross-subsidization and cash flow is mainly for government-owned utilities, and there's not a way for that capital to flow into the private sector. So, it happens, and it's done.
All right. So maybe I can also add one or two things. Don Croft, you mentioned a very important aspect. And I must mention here that in my previous life, I was a regulator here in Africa. So I know, for example, the quantum of this lifeline tariff that was provided to everyone, because it is very difficult to discriminate who is eligible to receive the lifeline tariff and who is not. So when I was a regulator, it was given to all customers across the board. And I remember that at one time, country A was providing 300 kilowatts, 300 kilowatt hours as a lifeline tariff to everybody, rich or poor. So I think that the reduction in most jurisdictions of a lifeline tariff can provide substantial resources towards provision of subsidies. Because, hey, here's what the government wants. The government just wants to do electrification. And, there's a low chance in many rural areas of Africa, there's a very low chance that the main grid connection will reach there, okay? And so the issue is, how do we reach those unreachable areas? And once they have been identified by a private sector, I think we need to have conversations with the governments, ministers, permanent secretaries, of the fact that they need to, let me say, bite the bullet, reduce tremendously the levels of lifeline tariffs, or completely do away with them, so that shortfall goes towards subsidization of the rural customers who are served by mini grids. And so, you know, the conversations that we need to have with government, because government policy is not clear in most cases, especially on people in rural areas wait for the extension of the grid extension for long years. But if the government was very candid and said that, look, there are areas where the national utility can serve, and there will be areas where mini grids will serve. If that pronouncement was done properly, people would stop waiting for the main grid and would have less and less worries about when the main grid arrives in an area which is designated for mini grids. The other conversation that we need to have with governments across Africa is the demarcation of areas. In our opinion, as African Forum for Utility Regulators, we think that there should be areas designated solely for mini grids, to be served by mini grids. If this was done, then you are encouraging mini grids, you are encouraging the acceptability. The issue in Africa is acceptability. When others are being served by the mini grid, the people that are not served by the mini grid continue waiting, like I said. So if there was a clear demarcation of the areas which are going to be served by the mini grids, and these pronouncements were made as a government policy, I think it would be very easy to increase the electrification rates in Africa. And we'll have no worries about what happens when the main grid arrives, because there will always be areas that have been demarcated to be essentially served by the mini grids. So that is what I wanted to say concerning the mini grid solutions and the demarcation of areas and the reduction or removal of the lifeline tariffs completely. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, James. And Dan, I'm seeing your hand up. Go for it.
Sure. It was just say, you know, all excellent points by James. I fully agree. And I don't know who's in the audience, but, you know, if there are regulators sitting there thinking this is all very well, but how do we actually remove or reduce the lifeline tariff? What do we do? I think we all need to be honest with ourselves and with each other. If we are saying, well, of course, all consumers compare what they're paying and what others are paying. If you want to keep the lifeline tariff, that's fine, but then it does have to be universal. And of course, there's a difference. If I'm a utility, effectively my cost of a kilowatt hour might be 3 cents and I'm selling it for 5. The opportunity cost for me of giving that away as a lifeline tariff is 2 cents, right? If you want to give the same 300 kilowatts, I think was the figure that James mentioned, kilowatt hours was mentioned in James's intervention, someone has to pay the mini grid provider for those 300 kilowatt hours. So actually that money has to be found. It's not the same trade-off. The easiest thing is actually to try and phase those out over time and explain what you're doing and being transparent about it. And the money that's saved goes into a pot along with all of the other. James mentioned donors. Yes, they have a role to play. Everybody has a role to play. Ideally, general taxation in due course will have a role to play. And ultimately, that's how you extend access. But just addressing one part of the equation is never going to do it.
This is great. James, I think I just saw you come off mute. Did you want to respond to that?
Hello, James, can you say that again? Thanks.
Yes, I just wanted to check. Did you want to respond to that? I saw that you were off mute.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I totally agree. In fact, in most countries around Africa, there's been a complete shift from the so-called lifeline tariffs, a complete shift. And I don't want to use the word abolition, but most countries have done away with those lifeline tariffs. Everyone, because government has realized, especially the situation that is obtaining especially in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a lot of shortage of electricity right now as we speak. South Africa and Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Namibia, they are all in shortfalls. So the little that can be garnered from different sources to develop mini grids, I think will go a long way in understanding the nitty-gritties of subsidization of power. So I'm happy that we are in a situation whereby we need solutions, and these solutions have to be done now. So a lot of talk is happening right now in the sub-Saharan Africa on how we can increase the generation capacity and in a short time. And the solution is mini grids. So there's a big opportunity right now for mini grids. And this opportunity also presents us, regulators, developers, financiers, and everybody else, to talk to government. And governments right now will be very willing to hear the side of developers to change policies and so on and so forth. So I don't know what direction we can take, but our role as African Forum for Utility Regulators is such that we recognize this opportunity and would like to develop some policies that we can convince government to adopt in terms of accelerating the development of mini grids. So these contributions that I'm hearing about, I think are very, very important and will go a long way in trying to speak to governments to change or to put in place policies that can accelerate the development. We have got a big chance right now because the shortfalls are massive, and load shedding, as you know, disrupts commerce, trade, and industry, and everything else. And government, which is going into an election year, would like to experience those blackouts. So yeah, we're in a good position to change policy and convince governments that the time is now. Thank you.
Thanks, James. And I'm conscious of time. Ignacio, I see your video coming on. Are you about to give us a 10-minute warning or an 8-minute warning now? Okay.
No, just to show you that I'm present. You're doing very well and you have time yet, 8 minutes.
Okay, great. We still have the microphone group.
Sure.
Well, with those 8 minutes, maybe what we can do is condense our final 2 questions into one here and save a couple of minutes at the end to respond to, I saw at least one question in the Q&A. But on these last 2, I think there's been general agreement on the importance of regulatory certainty, but a lot of this coming up in the last question was around this role of government and what should government be doing. Dan, you kind of raised in one end of the spectrum earlier, that there isn't time to wait for perfect regulation and perfect policy. And so being able to do things like regulating through contracts is one important thing to consider. But also a lot of what we've talked around rolling back lifeline tariffs. James, your point around clearly designating areas that could be for mini grids versus the main grid. There's clearly a lot of different ways that government can intervene and set policy in a way to provide that kind of regulatory certainty that everybody's looking for. So what do folks think is most important given the stage of the market? And as James rightly pointed out, given all the other challenges that government and regulators and utilities are facing right now, is it something that is more prescriptive, or should we all be thinking much more about more light touch policy now that could evolve over time?
Thanks, James. I'll give it the first start. Yeah, I think the markets evolve. It was great, right? We had 7-10 years ago in Tanzania and Kenya, so sort of like the Wild West, bottom up approach. The market developed, but at some point, right, that works, for a few pilots, and so on. But the sector needs volumes. They need to scale. They need economies of scales, to bring the cost down. right? So, you know, I think, you know, more permanent, more, you know, more, yeah, long-term frameworks. And I think the sector in overall has done quite well. We started with Tanzania being the example, and you know, things didn't really go well. I think you know, and actually the Tanzania example was then, you know, exported and adapted to Nigeria and then to Sierra Leone. But that was the original framework that everybody thought was the perfect model, right? It was still missing the details, and that's one of the reasons why it ended up not working out. But I think, so what governments need to do, I think they do need to implement these frameworks. They need, once they're implemented, they need to add the detail, right, the devil is in the details, again, for grid encroachment. But most importantly, once the details are added, and even if they're not, stick to it, right? You know, and I think that's what that was the main issue in Tanzania, right? The rules of the game were there. The government just did not abide to them, right? So, and it killed what it could have been, you know, one of the top markets, you know, in the sector. So, you know, things are improving, I hear lately in Tanzania, and you know, but I think that that's definitely from the regulatory point of view. There's another long Christmas list that I would add to this, but you know, once you set up a framework, you know, truly implement it, truly believe in it, and do not walk away from it. You can improve it, but you know, make sure you abide by it. Dan, I see your hand up.
Yeah, just to add to that, I agree with everything you've said. The upfront piece is critical, because governments do change, and you're not going to recover all of your money in the term of one government, right? So it's not just a question of, okay, they've set up the framework and then they get out of the way and allow the market to develop. Well, what will the next government do? And if they decide that they have a different policy, it's too late for you as an investor. You've sunk your money into the ground and that's it. You have to live with it. So two things you really can't do without: very, very tight sector planning, and then regulatory certainty, whatever that is. And you know, we come back again to the idea of regulation by contract. You don't have to get the perfect mini-grid law, mini-grid regulation policy. If you've got something that allows things to be bolted on, you can move quite quickly in a transactional context, thinking, right, we've got our sector planning, we want to attract developers to come to those areas in those lots, we've created the scale, but let's hear from the market what they need us to fix. We can fix that in a contract, and then the regulation can follow through afterwards. And then Caroline is right, once you've done it, you've got to stick with it, at least the key principles. But we also have to be realistic, right? There are changing circumstances, and we've seen regulatory changes in far more developed markets. Look at what the Spanish government did with some of the renewable energy subsidies, right? They just changed their mind because things change. That's okay. They're a sovereign government. Sometimes you have to retain flexibility to allow for changes. It's just important to remember that, you know, if you've signed a contract, there are often consequences that have to follow through, and then we have to make sure that there is the recourse that there needs to be through donor-funded risk mitigation and all the rest of it. But I personally like to see government proactive and engaged on an ongoing basis. The government that gets out of the way today may be in my way tomorrow, and that's not something I really want to see. So much better that they get it up front, a bit of light touch after that, but that we do see an engaged government that's keen to keep promoting the sector. That's what investors want to see, a government with a clear policy objective of increasing access in a sustainable way, and the rest will fall into place.
Fantastic. Two clear votes against the Wild West.
I also
James,
I also
last
want
word,
to add I also want to add just a few remarks as we come towards the end. I think it's what my two colleagues have discussed is very important. I think the understanding that the level of interest and the possible contribution of stakeholders is essential, for policymakers in order to design and implement a conducive mini-grid policy and regulatory framework. We need certainty. Like Don Croft said, governments in Africa and elsewhere, perhaps, they change very frequently. And if there's no policy and certainty, that could pose a problem or a challenge for the mini-grid developers. So we need, before grids can be developed, we need certainty in the regulatory structure, in the policy framework, and so on and so forth. And it is very true that these mini-grids will only recoup their investment 20, 30 years in the future. So if anything happens between then and now, then there's going to be a very big risk. So to mitigate that risk, we need to have policy put in place right away. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Could not have said that any better. And I think that's a great note to close on, and right on time. We could obviously keep this conversation going for a long, long time, but we'll have to stop here. And yes, again, thank you all for joining. Ignacio, thanks again for convening this group, and back over to you.
No, we have now a break of 10 minutes, and we will start again at 4:30 Central African time. 4:10, sorry, in 10 minutes. Thank you very much. Great panel.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we'll see you in 10 minutes. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Frederick, I'm speaking in the English channel. Can we test your mic, please? This is Gazi speaking on the English channel. Frederick, I don't hear you. You are in the English, but I don't hear you. I cannot hear you, so we will Frederick, we will I don't know. I think there is an issue with your mic. Are you in the English now? You are in the English channel, but I cannot hear you. I'll ask for my colleague 1 second. Frederic, we cannot hear you, unfortunately. We are trying to fix it, to fix the issue from our end, but we still cannot hear you.
I cannot hear you. So Frederic, if you can go on the bottom left, there's like a microphone, you know this already, I guess. So just to go through your audio settings and then see maybe it's your microphone for some reason is not connected to Zoom. And then you can test your microphone. So yeah, you can write us in chat, like in private chat. If you can not, you can write us on WhatsApp if so I don't know, I'm not sure even if you can hear us or not. Hello.
Frederic, Magdalene, can you confirm on WhatsApp that you hear Frederic on the French channel, please? Yeah, Frederic can hear us, but we cannot hear you.
Okay, so he,
Yeah, something.
so
must transition to an energy model that is inclusive, enables industrialization and development, and contributes to the common universal goal of fighting climate change.
A number of barriers exist that prevent African countries from using the abundant energy resources available on the continent in an environmentally friendly way and in a manner that will promote inclusive growth and development. These barriers include the lack of regulations, the lack of institutions to design and implement the regulations, and the lack of a critical mass of professionals to manage the energy sector. It is precisely to address these challenges that the initiative has been launched to establish an African School of Regulation.
The combination of the viewpoints of engineering, economics, and law is vital to address these challenges. In response to these needs, a partnership of leading institutions deeply involved in the African energy sector and the global clean energy transition has launched the African School of Regulation initiative.
The African School of Regulation, the ASR, aims to be a center of excellence for education, applied research, independent discussion, and knowledge exchange, with the purpose of improving the quality of African energy regulation and policy.
In Africa, run by Africans and for Africa. The African School of Regulation will provide inclusive education designed by academics and practitioners to meet African professional needs, opportunities to share best practices and discuss freely present issues in African energy regulation, research for solutions to challenging current problems in energy regulatory practice, and a repository of indispensable and diverse resources. Join our efforts for a sustainable, reliable, and affordable energy in Africa.
Time to start again. Gassi?
Yes, please, Ignacio, please, you can proceed now. Interpretation is working
recording now?
fine. Yeah, all good, please. Thanks.
Okay, so welcome to the second panel of today, panel 4, Achieving Scalability. This is, I assume, a continuation of the discussion that we had in the previous panel, given the scalability and sustainability that are so closely interrelated. So the floor is yours. Simon, I think you are the one that will be joining us as moderator in this panel. Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt, Ignacio. Simon is muted. I asked him to unmute.
Apologies. You would have thought after so long you would learn the lesson, but we all slip into that problem. So, Ignacio, thank you for the introduction. Hopefully, you can talk. You can hear me this time. And many thanks for the invitation to present this panel session at this inaugural event. We at GridWorks are very big supporter of anything that can move this space in the right direction, and we hope this initiative will be a great success, and we will be a big supporter of it. So over to the panel specifically, and I'll give a little brief introduction to myself. I'm the CEO of GridWorks. GridWorks is a company that develops and invests specifically in Africa's networks. We are a developer and investor in both the, if you like, the main grid and the off-grid space. And we see both areas of being of critical importance in delivering the change that is needed, which gave rise to the setting up of GridWorks by BII, our shareholder, 4 or 5 years ago. So I'll talk a little bit more about what we're doing at GridWorks a little bit later, but I'll introduce my panelists in the first instance, and then we'll go over to the questions that we're going to discuss and address. So Ricardo Ridolfi is based in Kampala, Equatorial Power. I'll let you introduce yourself in a short moment, but you've obviously raised capital from Engie. You're a credible partner. You have 6 sites in a number of countries. You're active in not just Uganda, but DRC, Rwanda, and Tanzania, and you have some very aggressive growth plans. So we'll be interested to talk to you later than that. Alex from Winch, you're also in Kampala. You have projects in Uganda and Sierra Leone, and an interesting finance solution and a slightly different business model from others, and we look forward to hearing about that a little bit later. And William Brent from Husk. Your business has a good track record. You come from operating in India and bringing the lessons learned from India. I understand that you are also EBITDA positive, which in your business. So we'll be very interested to hear the business model that you employ and your views on the sector. So I'll start initially by just setting the scene, the way we see the world at GridWorks, and then asking the panelists to see how they see the sector and their particular activities in it. So African continent, depending on which statistics you read, is close to 700 million people without access. Demographics, 30 million people a year. The population is increasing by 30 million a year. The main grid is providing access to approximately 10 million people a year, and depending on which set of data sets you read, the mini grid space is providing new connections to a much smaller number than that. So from whatever lens you look at this, the main grid, solar home systems, and mini grids together are not really making today much of a dent in this significant number of people without access. And clearly the reason that we're all convening here today is that there is recognition that more has to be done on main grid and on the off-grid sector. I know there's a reference to mini grids. We prefer at GridWorks to just call them greenfield grids. But that's another topic, how we refer to them. There are a number of things that we've experienced at GridWorks, I mean, which are sort of problematic to achieving scale. Yes, it's regulation. Yes, it's access to capital. It's the tariffs, it's affordability, it's taking market risk. It's the time it takes to actually develop something that can be meaningfully and credibly considered investable. And we know that many mini grids in sort of, if you like, evolution 1.0 fail to achieve their commercial aspirations. We all understand the importance of electrification and delivering it through main grid and greenfield grids. But the question is, how do we actually really make a meaningful dent and scale up what has already started? The initial interventions in mini grids are evolving. we ourselves at GridWorks have several interventions in this space, and I think we are all learning, and the point of this exercise today is to how we can learn from each other and how we can do what we're doing better, and how we can all collectively make more of a dent in the problem in hand. I will, the questions that I will ask the panelists to talk about initially are sort of, what do you consider is holding back the sector? I've set the scene: mini grids, greenfield grids, in whatever iteration of their evolution you think they are not yet making the dent which is required on the continent. What has to happen over the next 3, 5, 10 years to really increase the scale and penetration of these activities? And I would also like to ask you to talk about your own business and your income and your respective business models, and how you see what you're doing is how it's differentiated from other people, and how it's having an impact. So perhaps I could start with you, Ricardo. Go to you first, and perhaps you can share with us what you're doing and how you see the market.
Thank you, Simon. Pleasure to be here. Thanks, Ignacio and team, for the invite. So very briefly, Equatorial Power, so our company sees the world, to take it from where you left off, as an evolution in terms of we to be a little provocative, we don't even care so much about energy or electricity as much as services enabled by that energy through distributed infrastructure. So what we think differentiates us is we look at a customer. We believe that the 700 million plus rural or poorer Africans can be good customers, bankable customers, if a lot of investment is put into their growth in the short term. So effectively, our model involves, I would say, 2 tiers. The first is to negotiate concessions beyond the grid and invest in growing the socio-economic fiber of a community in the short term, so as to benefit in the mid to long term together through the offering of a number of services, from electricity, water purification, cold chain processing, mobility, and internet. And the second is, and I have the benefit here of sitting on the board of the Ugandan national utility, UMEME, and so I've learned over time that yes, energy access is essential. I would say it's an emergency, so time is of the essence, but it is an incomplete solution if achieved at the cost of national system bankability. So integration with the national grid, which will still continue to represent the vast majority of new customers accessing power, is a must. And so the second tier, what we're trying to do is figure out how to interact and render the difficult parts of the grid, where the national utility is less apt, i.e. rural areas, more bankable through integration. So that's us in a nutshell. To answer your question and throw the ball back at my fellow panelists, I would separate the theme of sort of impediments into 3 macro themes: government policy and regulation, financing, and developers, innovation and business model and technology. So to start from governments, ultimately, we have to agree and align that this is an emergency, because time is of the essence. And we have to all look ourselves in the eyes and realize that this is an inherently and heavily regulated sector. And so we cannot we cannot divorce it from political will. So policy, regulation have to enable this. And often I've seen in our experience that excellent is the enemy of the good. So a tremendous effort by donors and regulators to get it right cost us years and years. And in Uganda, I could make multiple examples of 5, 6 years on where no connections made. DRC, same thing. Whereas I think the approach here, considering the emergency of not only 700 million people without power, but the fact that number is growing every single year. So we need to be able to deploy capital in iterations. And there is, to me, governments and regulators in Africa, in my experience, do not sufficiently take account of time. And there's I would say, a lack of accountability. If you look today at announcements made, fast forward 5 years and look back, nothing will happen. Even if the target was 10% more of the population connected and not even 1% was reached, there's no consequence, right? So I think that's my first message, because that is the key driver. Without that, all our efforts are vain. And in fact, we try to select our countries as much as possible based on where we think that political willingness is there. Secondly, finance. There's a lot of capital available. Nevertheless, I think the right type of capital at the right time is still difficult to obtain. And I'll explain myself. I think that this is inherently infrastructure. Furthermore, infrastructure for service to poor people. So it's odd when NG or NL are funding themselves at 1% per annum interest rate over 30 years, and we are accessing, as DRE players, venture capital type money, right? So there's a disconnect between what will happen in terms of tariff to these poorest of the earth. So I think there is a need today of entities that understand that in the short term, we need more flexible risk-taking capital, perhaps with a high return yield, but with flexibility, it is unfathomable to think that we can yield today the types of bankable, perfectly bankable portfolios that allow infra capital to deploy 100 million, if not $1 billion today. But again, that cannot happen unless there is capital to enable the first step, right? And at the same time, that's not the right capital to continue the journey. The right capital to continue the journey is the far lower yield type capital, the infra capital for the long term. So if I had one wish in this sense, I would wish for a fund, perhaps like Gridworks, wink, wink, that could provide a smaller pocket of more flexible risk-taking capital and then support it with a much larger, lower yield long-term infrastructure capital. Last but not least, developers. So I've pointed some fingers. Let me point some fingers at myself. I think that we have a duty to innovate further. There is a lot of technology available today that wasn't available 5 years ago. There is a lack, in my view, of business model innovation. There's always a fear of doing too much and not being focused, and I think that's fair. On the other hand, I do think that the whole world has evolved and is evolving in terms of what electricity can and ought to do. I always make the comment that you'll never find anybody in the world who's happy with electricity bill. There's this kind of 100-year-old sentiment that power should be a public good, and therefore whatever, I don't know how much I'm paying, to be honest, but I know that I think it's too much, right? Whereas the truth is I'm happy to brag at over a coffee with a mate how little I'm paying for my telephone contract, where maybe I'm paying through the roof for that data. So there's a very strong inelasticity, in my view, on price for electrons and less so for service. So I think that the answer for developers is further service integration and perhaps bundling, which is also a message to regulators, because if regulators do not allow for tariff or price bundling, then we have another problem again. But I would summarize by saying, yes, there's the first issue is political willingness and regulation. The second is the right finance, but ultimately it also comes down to developers being brave enough to integrate models, integrate service offering, and leverage technology at best. Thank you, Simon.
Thanks, Ricardo. Just taking up, you managed to get, as always, quite a lot in your 5 minutes worth, which is probably more than 5 minutes. But the right sort of capital at the right time, I completely get you with that. It's the framework and the setting up and the regulatory and the environment. It's the project development, which is at risk, the next at risk money, and then it's the operating capital. And at the moment, you rightly said that it's all a bit blurred and mixed together, and we haven't got the right capital. Completely agree with you in that. Well, your point on the way electricity is sold is also quite interesting. The electricity sector and if you like, the communication sector evolved 25 years ago from a model which used to be quite similar to the way electricity is still built today, to a more bundled model, which recognized that the investors were switching, basically making fixed capital expenditure types of investment, and needed a revenue model that made sense for them. And 20 years later, it sort of gave rise to, as you say, the bundled packages which people talk about. What do you think the lessons are there, and why do you think the electricity sector hasn't learned a trick, and why hasn't it yet gone that way, if you think it will?
Thanks, Simon. I think ultimately it comes down to the asset owner. So telecoms are, largely privatized, and I think that the private sector has been very aggressive in optimizing and exploring various ways to better sell their services, whereas the power sector, at least at point of sale, at least in developing markets, because I think that's less so in Europe today. But recently, I would say it's largely due to the fact that it's been publicly controlled or heavily regulated to the point that, so that would be my answer in short. I do think that it should go in that direction. The case for DRE is quite particular, and I think it should follow as much as possible the evolution of not only telecom services, but digital infrastructure. Because for every call you make, there is a tower somewhere and a data center somewhere, or which is allowing you to provide that service, and that is infrastructure. So I think the joint lesson of telecom operators as well as digital infrastructure deployment is something that we can benefit a lot from in the DRE world.
Okay, thank you, Ricardo. Moving to you, William. At Huskverna, what could you same sort of really question to yourself? How do you see the market, the greenfield grid, let's call them greenfield grids, role in this market, how it's evolving, and what can really be made to changes that you would really like to make, if you could wave a magic wand to accelerate the process of really making a dent in this, and please share with us more information about Huskverna and the model that you're applying in both India and Africa.
Sure, happy to. So Husk is 15 years old. We've been around the block for a long time. We have about between 150 and 200 mini grids in operation across India and sub-Saharan Africa. Our system size typically around 50 kilowatts, solar plus biomass gasification plus batteries. And as you mentioned, we announced that we're profitable in our main markets this morning, which we believe is we're the first company to achieve that milestone in the industry. We think it's important, if we're going to actually step up and meet the scale that the World Bank says that we should be meeting, which is to power almost 500 million people. We need to, start to achieve scale. In order to achieve scale, you've got to come up with a sustainable business model that can, be commercially viable over the long term. So we've gotten there. That's a big step for us, we think, for the industry as well. I would say that in terms of what we do, we're not unlike Equatorial. I think many of the mini grid developers in the industry today, they would say it's all about the services that you can ride on top of the electrons. So, electricity is a handshake, and then you build layers around that, including energy services. So I think that's similar. What I'd say is, we do work in both in different types of settings. In India, we're completely under the grid, competing head to head with the discoms there. So under the grid is one situation that they're working in. The other is off grid, which is most of our sites in Africa. But we're also starting to do this year grid integrated mini grid. So we look at the market as three parts, and we're active in all three. And then the other thing I would just add is that for us, we think that you're not going to be able to sort of achieve the type of socioeconomic development that governments want, that we want, without really coming up with a strategy that takes advantage of SMEs, MSMEs in the communities where we're working, and building a model that really drives economic growth from that core base of customers, the SMEs and the MSMEs. So I think that's another aspect that I would highlight for Husk. You asked what's the 3, 5, 10-year plan. We actually published a industry roadmap in November. I'll share the link in the chat right now. But essentially that was targeted at the developer, but it also has a lot, I think, of implications for investors and governments as well. And we identified 3 main things. Maybe 4 things that are critical for us as an industry to follow in order to achieve the scale that we're talking about. One is cost, and getting the levelized cost of energy down to a level where the power becomes much more affordable. We're at under 30 cents per kilowatt hour now. We think we can get down to, around 20. Paired with that on the supply side is the demand, and really being able to generate the demand required to create a viable business model. That's, we measure that through ARPU and capacity utilization factor of our assets. And then third is quality, and making sure that we're maintaining the quality that can distinguish us against other types of solutions like the grid and diesel generation. All of those things, if they're done, you still have to scale it, right? And that's not trivial, and requires a lot of technology innovation, business model innovation to do that. So, we followed that roadmap to get to profitability, and, we would encourage the rest of the industry to approach us, and we're happy to work with others to help get the rest of the industry there as well.
William, I think it would be quite interesting to hear a little bit about how your model of, if you like, grids operating within a main grid differ from the model of, if you like, grids interfaced with a main grid or a standalone, because obviously that's a slightly different model. It'd be interesting to, particularly if you're actually competing with your mothership.
Right. So we're not yet. We haven't done a grid integrated mini grid yet. We're in final stages of negotiations to do that. So, stay tuned for more information on that. We'll be interested to find that out ourselves, Simon. In terms of India, India is interesting because, as I think I mentioned, it's entirely under the grid, right? So India, the government has electrified most, if not all, of the country, but you're still stuck with a lot of regions where the supply is unreliable. So we're competing head to head with the main grid in India, and also competing with diesel generation as well. And that's really been a forcing function for us to really tackle as much or take out as much inefficiency and optimize the systems that we've developed as much as possible, through automation and through other business model innovations that we've adopted over the years. And that's enabled us to get to where we are, right? I would say that, it's not that different. The system size, everything's standard, India, Nigeria, for example. It's just the customer mix is different. And we don't have the competition in off-grid settings, whereas in India, we're competing head to head. So that experience has really informed our business model. There's nothing that can help, that's going to drive your costs down than some stiff competition. And, sure, the discoms in India aren't 100% reliable, but they're, delivering electricity at a highly subsidized cost. It's tough to compete against. We are doing that, and we're growing at our CAGR, our compound annual growth rate, during COVID was over 60%. So, I think that really has informed our business, and everything that's gone into our business, and allowed us to port that from India to similar markets like Nigeria and Africa.
And the immediate growth plans for Husk. How do you see your company's own development in the next 2, 3, 4 years?
Yeah, so we stated publicly that, so we've gotten, let's say our sort of baseline is 150 mini grids today. It's more than that, but let's just use that as the number. We want to grow 10x over the next 4 to 5 years. So we want to get to 1,500 mini grids. That's going to be inclusive of India, Nigeria, and additional sub-Saharan markets that we'll be entering starting this year.
So a question for you, William, is when for you is a mini grid a grid?
That's like a philosophy question, Simon. I'm not sure.
Is it a matter of size? Is it a matter of what is it?
So when does a mini grid not become a mini grid?
When is a mini grid just a grid?
Yeah, to me, a mini grid is a grid. If you look at
I think you've answered the question.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I was looking for. Okay. Yeah. Now, last but not least, Alex from Winch, you are also based in Kampala. Perhaps you could share with us your your perspectives on the market overall, and give the other listeners and participants a perspective of Winch and what you're doing, your business model, where you're active. And if you could wave your magic wand, what would be the 1, 2, 3 things that you would really like to see to boost the transformation of intervention in this space?
Thank you, Simon. Thank you for the introduction. Yes, like I mentioned earlier in the morning, we have just now commissioned 27 mini-grids in last year in the country. And we are well on in the pipeline. We have around 40 more mini-grids that we want to commission by the end of this year. We're trying to follow in William's footprints. Hopefully we can get there soon. But I mean, what all this goes to show is that it's all about the scale. We have realized that to achieve this effectiveness in terms of operations of mini-grids, it's all about the scale. You want to have optimization when it comes to the capex, when it comes to the EPC contractors that you're using, when it comes to using of electricity productively. So we have centered our mini-grids around productive use. And I think this is something that all other mini-grid providers have now seen as a very important use case. So we do have the distributed assets model, but now each of those villages, we have centered it around productive use. So we find that this is useful in terms of driving up incomes and making sure that the project is profitable, so that you can attract more profit, because like everyone will tell you, you're getting these funds from private funders, but you also have an expectation in terms of the rate of return. So you want to make sure that you can meet the expectations, but also it's a double-edged sword. If the government has come in and given you a limitation in terms of the tariff that they want. For example, in Uganda, it's a silent secret that the government wants a tariff of 29 cents. So meaning it's just a matter of like, I have $20 million in the bank. Let me go and do mini-grids worth 20 million. You now have that double-edged sword that I have to make sure that it's within the 29 cents. Of course, we're in the process of optimizing and trying to make sure that we can come down with as low a tariff as possible. But this is, of course, is very possible when you have scale. So what does this mean? That we need subsidies from the market. We have been fortunate enough that right now we are sitting on maybe around $8 million worth of subsidies that we are looking to deploy. So that has been a positive for us, especially in the environment in Uganda. The government has come in and is trying to make it as conducive as the environment as possible. They're putting the regulations. One of the issues that we used to have was what happens when the grid arrives, what would you do from the funders, but that has been sorted. But in response to your question is, what would I, if I had the magic wand, what would I do today to make sure that we can achieve scale in the shortest time possible? Number one, I would encourage DFIs to put in place de-risking factors or de-risking agents. What do I mean by this? Like if copy what they've done with their own grid. It's no secret that our own grid is maybe around 110% subsidized right from generation up to the distribution right now. Whereas with mini-grids, to get even up to 40% or 30% subsidy, because you want to achieve the low level of tariffs that you want. So if we can have these levels of guarantees like they did on on-grid, for example, generations were given a deemed energy clause in their PPAs, where they were guaranteed a certain amount of revenue, even when they have underperformed. And this spurred a lot of investment in the generation sector of the country. Even with mini-grids, that is something that can be similar, de-risking all these investments by the private sector. That would be very helpful. The second one is reducing the time that is taken to allocate mini-grids. Ricardo will tell you this also, that in the country, it's also hard to just go and say, I want this number of mini-grids, let me start developing them. They have developed sort of like a tender approach, where they have to sit down for maybe 4 or 5 years, and then they release a tender. And then when the tender is released, they may sit for around 2 years before you're ready to now actually implement the tender. That is 7 years. That's a luxury of time that we cannot afford, especially with the limited private capital that we have. So a limitation, they should bring in a mechanism where it's not only tender, but even if we're able to source our own subsidies privately, and we can go and look for sites, and we can achieve them even in 1 year, that would be something that would really be welcome in the sector. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Alex. I mean, there are a few comments there, sort of market risk, subsidies. How how, and it's interesting listening to William. I mean, their business model is successful without subsidies. To what extent is your business model, or can it become sustainable without subsidies, or do you see subsidies as being an integral part of the model and the need to have it structured and in a more disciplined and sort of certain way? I think because you're right, so subsidies are an integral part of the landscape, or have been historically, but often that the subsidies on the main grid have not been explicit. They're often hidden, or they come in from the side. So tell me about your sort of perspective of how, both as it applies to winch and how you see subsidies generally for the sector, and how you, if you think that there is a continual need for them, how they should be structured and driven and applied.
Thank you, Simon. Well, it will be interesting to hear the tariffs that William is also operating with in the mini grids as well, because right now, like I mentioned, there's a sort of an upper cap that we are working with within the country, 29 cents. I know William has now achieved less than 30 cents without tariffs, so I think there's a lot we can still improve on our side, which we shall look into. But right now, even with that expectation, without subsidies, our tariff will be around maybe 40 or 50 cents. Maybe the distinguishing factor will be the sizes of the villages. Uganda, we don't really have very large villages where it's easy to deploy even 100 connections. That will be, you'll be very lucky to find such villages. So we are working with villages with around 50 to 60 to 70 connections at most. Of course, we have the exceptions where you can have 100, but you may find that your average size per village is maybe around 50 to 60 connections. So you find that once you do the optimization, and then you put in consideration the capex costs and also the O&M costs. I mean, you have a village of 60 customers, and you still have to do the same level of service for them that would have been equally for a village of maybe 200 customers. So this is where the issue comes in for us. So subsidies are still needed, I think, for us in our sector. But yeah, like you have mentioned, there's Ricardo also mentioned that a lot has developers to learn, and something that we'll do as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Alex. We've got a bit of time left, and I've got a few other thoughts I'd like to share with the panel. And it's one of the themes that has come up, and that's market risk. Now, the grid developers, mini grid developers, at the moment are effectively taking market risk, and unlike which is not the case, let's say, in generation with IPP developers. So people like yourself, Ricardo, might be trying to put together a concession, and it might take years, and you might be doing feasibility studies trying to understand the ability to pay, willingness to pay, and levels of affordability. And ultimately, many, depending on the model applied in any given country, mini grid developers are having to take that risk, are having to spend years and years and years trying to develop, undertake studies at great cost to determine what level, what size system, what size network to build. Do you think that is something that needs to be thought about? Is that really the way to incentivize the private sector to come in and put a lot of capital into this space and having to take that risk, or should another solution be found? I mean, I'll throw that to you, Ricardo.
Thank you, Simon. I'll try and be consistent with what I said previously. So excellent is the enemy of the good. So I will not pontificate over what I think would be the excellent solution, but a very pragmatic solution is that investors understand that and understand that ultimately, I mean, if you zoom out, the picture is clear, right? There are two things to be seen. Number one, that all these people will be power consumers, and with the provision of power and other services, will become better consumers with a higher ARPU over time. So if we accept A and B, namely that with the current status of many developing market treasuries, right, with debt ceilings, etc., you'd rather put $1 billion to work across 10 countries and millions of individual retail customers as opposed to against a PPA with one bankrupt off-taker. So if you accept these two as a large investor, then you know ultimately what you have to help the developer do is get to the point of bankability. So again, if you separate your capital, but 10%, for example, indulge me, higher risk and 90% infra, which is, by the way, what we're getting offered for any CNI type deal. CNI investors, so commercial and industrial investors, B2B investors, are willing to put sort of 10, 15% upfront high risk capital to develop a larger pipeline, into which then they deploy their less risky capital. So something like this would enable the developer to share the risk with the investor. I do think the developer needs to take a degree of risk and learn how to take it better. But again, ultimately, it will come down to the regulatory framework to enable a faster process. I want to pick up briefly on what Alex said. I mean, I used to be a lawyer and did tendering as well, and I fully believe in the virtues of tenders. I don't believe in the virtues of tenders when you don't know what you're tendering. And so, in many of these examples, we've seen 5, 6, sometimes 10 years, where, by the way, you've got closed envelope tenders that expose the whole thing to more fraud, and you're ultimately waiting. And so the risk you're taking as a developer then is a closed-ended risk, is a risk that is a binary risk where you could lose it all the time and money you've spent could be gone if you're not awarded. I'm much more a proponent of the more popular model today of rolling results-based financing, where you are shortlisted based on criteria, and which allows you to get, whether it's a subsidy or other type of funding, allows you to have a contract that says, hey, if you develop and build a mini grid or a grid that has these characteristics, you'll get our money. And therefore, that's a measured risk that we are taking. We have certainty that if we can do our job, if we can do it well, then the money will come. So I think there are existing mechanisms that are virtuous. And I think that the two things that would really change the scene and truly accelerate are, on the one hand, quicker permitting regulation. So a regulatory framework, perhaps in 2 steps, where the first step provides sufficient comfort to investors without the full-blown application process. Because even when you hear license exemption regimes, sometimes a license exemption takes 9 months and it is 1,000 pages, right? So it requires a level of detail, which is still a hurdle. And then the second pillar is, again, investors. The type of investor that has sufficient capital to deploy and scale should also have a pocket, perhaps through a partnership or through its own segregated pocket, that is willing to share that risk, that development risk, which inevitably needs to be paid for. I hope that answers some of your questions, Simon.
Yeah, thank you, Ricardo. William, same question to you. I mean, how do you think of the development, the market risk and demand and affordability risk that are taken by grid developers, and how could that be optimized, or should it be?
I mean, so businesses take risk, right? That's what we do. So I think that's normal. In a regulated industry that's considered a basic service, we probably take too much risk as an industry, I would say, currently. I think I would like to just point out, I think one of the things that we also talk about in our roadmap is that, everybody's sort of still looking at the markets in a monolithic way, that you go into a country and you set one RBF as a subsidy, CapEx subsidy for all sites, no matter what kind of site they are. And so in the roadmap, we tried to identify 3 market types that should therefore have different types of support. There's a commercially viable market like India, where there's no subsidy required. There's a sort of transitional bridge type market that's on the path to commercial viability. that might require some subsidy for a period of time. And then there are going to be communities, probably like some of the ones in Uganda that we heard about, that are going to need subsidy on an ongoing basis, right? And those three types of markets, and there may be more, you could divide it even more finely. All of those markets exist in one country. So governments, regulators need to take that into account instead of having this blunt instrument of one RBF number for all types of sites, and become more nuanced in terms of how they're approaching it. The other thing that I get sick and tired of talking about is the fact that, you know, there is a lot of hidden subsidy in the main grid, and no one's done an apples to apples comparison of how much they're receiving on an ongoing basis in terms of OpEx support. We're sort of expected to take the CapEx subsidy and then figure it out ourselves without any additional support on an ongoing basis. That is fundamentally a skewed marketplace, and that needs to be somehow addressed. Either remove the subsidies entirely so everybody's playing on the same field, or, you know, truly work with the private sector as a partner, and come up with a way to help us in those communities where subsidy will be an ongoing requirement. So I think that's something that I would, you know, ask of regulators and government agencies going forward.
It's a very good point, William, and I've heard it raised, you know, many times that there's not a level playing field, and it's not really helped by the fact that the multilaterals and donors provide funding to loss-making utilities across the continent to promote access, when there is not necessarily any pathway to sustainability, either explicit or otherwise. Yeah. And actually, you know, obviously providing funding to loss-making utilities to increase their base when they're already losing money with every electron they deliver just makes the situation worse. So I've heard that argument raised a number of times, not just by mini-grid developers, and I think it's a very valid point, that perhaps funding should be applied to utilities on the basis that they should show a pathway to sustainability, and there should be more of a level playing field. I think that's probably subject to another panel session. We've got 3 minutes left. Start with you. You got a minute left to closing remarks. So up to you, William. Yeah.
Remarks. My closing remarks. Thank you.
You got to end with a bang.
I don't have a bang. I'm just going to, thank Alex, Ricardo, and you, Simon, as well as Ignacio, for putting this thing on. And Husk Power as a company looks forward to working with everybody who's interested in working with us. We know partnership. Here's my bang. We're not gonna succeed as an industry unless we have more partners who come and join us. And that's not just financial partners. It could be microcredit finance, for appliance sales, agricultural partners who can come in to work with us at the site level to really try and aggregate demand. So we often ignore that, but I think partnership is critical across the board. Thanks.
Thank you, William.
The HR could be a partner also.
Sorry, I missed that, Ignacio. What did you say? That
the ASR could be a partner also.
I think ASR could be a partner to us all. So, Alex, you got a very short number of seconds for your closing remarks.
No, I think mine is also pretty much just thanking everyone for this opportunity. And yes, like William said, it's good that we should come together and refine the solutions. And I think it's high time as developers our voices heard, and because we are the ones on the ground who know what is happening, and all this financing that comes should develop from a bottom-up approach so that everyone can benefit. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Alex. And last but not least, Ricardo, let's have a little bit of a crescendo from yourself.
Thanks, Simon. So I will say that this is an emergency and we need to work together, and there's too much adversarial approach between regulators, financiers, actors. This is such a massive emergency that there's plenty of fight for all of us to fight together. And I think that because it's an emergency, any actor that takes too long should get out the way. I think that honestly, there are too many donors, financiers, regulators, and developers that simply take too long at the cost of poor people who can't access services. So let's treat this as an emergency, and thank you all.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Thank you, William. Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you, everybody, all the participants tuning in. I hand over to you, Ignacio.
No, thank you very much to all of you. And we have a break now, 10 minutes, and then we'll come back. Great
Thank you,
panel.
everybody.
Thank you, Simon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Simon. Thank you all.
Africa must transition to an energy model that is inclusive, enables industrialization and development, and contributes to the common universal goal of fighting climate change.
A number of barriers exist that prevent African countries from using the abundant energy resources available on the continent in an environmentally friendly way and in a manner that will promote inclusive growth and development. These barriers include the lack of regulations, the lack of institutions to design and implement the regulations, and the lack of a critical mass of professionals to manage the energy sector. It is precisely to address these challenges that the initiative has been launched to establish an African School of Regulation.
The combination of the viewpoints of engineering, economics, and law is vital to address these challenges. In response to these needs, a partnership of leading institutions deeply involved in the African energy sector and the global clean energy transition has launched the African School of Regulation initiative.
The African School of Regulation, the ASR, aims to be a center of excellence for education, applied research, independent discussion, and knowledge exchange, with the purpose of improving the quality of African energy regulation and policy.
In Africa, run by Africans and for Africa. The African School of Regulation will provide inclusive education designed by academics and practitioners to meet African professional needs opportunities to share best practices and discuss freely present issues in African energy regulation, research for solutions to challenging current problems in energy regulatory practice, and a repository of indispensable and diverse resources. Join our efforts for a sustainable, reliable, and affordable energy in Africa.
Hello, everyone. So this is time to start the third panel of the day, panel 5, how to make it happen. I think that the two previous panels have shown that sustainability is hard because we need to find a way of getting those subsidies that are needed in most cases somehow. And scalability is also tough. Because the business need to grow, and again you need the subsidies, and people are thinking of smaller projects. I think that now we have the opportunity of trying to make a dent, as Simon was saying, into how to address the problem. And so I think that I will pass the floor to our moderator, expert in the World Bank on mini-grids, Benjamin Cournier.
Thank you, Ignacio.
You are muted, I guess.
No,
no,
can colleagues hear me? Can
Yes.
colleagues hear me? I'm not muted. Unless I've changed jobs, I'm not quite at the World Bank. I'm rather at the African Development Bank. So I'll just correct that very rapidly.
Yes. I always get confused, and I try to email you at the time that thinking that you are sleeping and everything. Yeah, sorry.
No, but thank you, Ignacio. And it really doesn't matter. We're all, I think, on the same team, and we're all trying to do very much the same job and achieve very much the same objectives, which are, of course, to see a vibrant and healthy mini-grid market develop that is as well on its way to achieving SDG 7. So, as Ignacio has pointed out, welcome to this fifth panel of the conference entitled How to Make It Happen. I'm deeply thankful, Ignacio, for giving us what I would argue is probably the most challenging question. We've explored, obviously, some of the questions around business models, some of the questions about regulatory approaches, but of course, you know, the key question, of course, comes with regards to when the rubber hits the road. How do we actually do this, and how do we start to kind of make a change? And that's really what we're going to be exploring over the course of the next hour. I'm joined, hopefully, online, and I can see Temitope already. So we're joined by Temitope Udo Afia, who's the coordinator of off-grid regulation and markets at Get Transformed, GIZ. So thank you for joining. Likewise, we're joined by Dennis Enderitu, who is the manager for energy systems over at the over at GAP, so that's the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet. And lastly, but certainly not by least, we're joined by Raul Alfaro Perico, who is the senior director of the Africa Energy Program and the Energy Transition Academy at RMI. And I will give each of them an opportunity to introduce themselves and what they're up to shortly. For myself, my name is Benjamin Cournier. I am the Principal Green Minigrids Officer at the CIFA Fund at the AFDB. To recap, the CIFA Fund is a special fund within the African Development Bank. It is a multi-donor trust fund. In African Development Bank speak, we call it a special fund because it is a multi-instrument fund. So historically, CIFA used to only provide technical assistance, aiming to catalyze renewable energy projects in Africa. Since 2 years ago, it was transformed into a special fund, and the exciting thing there is that we now can deploy a range of financial interventions to catalyze projects. So that means concessional investment as well. So we can invest grants, concessional instruments in a range of forms into investment projects. We have 3 portfolios under CIFA. One called Green Baseload, which is essentially grid-tied renewables, utility scale. We have a second portfolio, which is the Green Minigrids, which I'm responsible for, and then we have a third portfolio under energy efficiency. I just want to kind of spend maybe 30 seconds explaining what we do under the Green Minigrid portfolio, because I think it's relevant to today's conversation. Really, we kind of try and intervene into the market through three main ways. The first is that we have a technical assistance program. It's called the African Minigrid Acceleration Program, or AMAP. That is a $7 million technical assistance program in which we try to provide support packages to beneficiary countries, all with the aim of identifying or developing their mini-grid markets. So that intervenes at a regulatory level to try and put in place the regulatory tools that are required to develop the market. And it intervenes through a project identification level to try and identify sites, identify projects, conduct the required dimensioning work, construct then kind of procurement processes in order to get those projects to market. And I think you'll all agree with me, today there is a distinct lack of pipeline of projects really coming into the market. And so that's how, that's our offering to try and catalyze that. The second is to then provide funding into those projects, and to do so through that range of tools that I referred to. So that's really trying to address that viability gap funding for mini-grids. Obviously, for the most part, that's some form of grant, be it an RBF or otherwise, but increasingly we're trying to become a little bit more innovative and deploying some of those other tools that have been mentioned through the course of this afternoon and yesterday. So thinking a little bit about demand mitigation tool or demand risk mitigation tools, Forex tools, and so on and so forth. And then very thirdly, because those two first bits are quite hard work, we also fund into other funds as well. So there are third-party funds that are also funding mini-grids, be it on a platform level or on that equity side. And so we are interested in trying to provide some of our risk capital to cornerstone commercial funding into those as well. So that's really the three areas that we intervene in. So let's get back to the question in hand for today. The aim of the panel is to explore what practical steps are required to implement sustainable and scalable green mini-grids. Now, we've explored, I think, kind of what might be considered sustainable and scalable business models in these previous sessions. And some of the themes that have been discovered, I think, or that have been discussed include, I think, an effective process for identifying and developing and tendering green mini-grid sites, be it a bottom-up or a top-down approach. Obviously, the need to ensure full cost recovery, very important, obviously, in order to maintain the quality of service that we're looking for and set the platform for growth by leveraging the private sector and its capital as much as possible. The need to ensure a fair tariff structure. And we've noted, I think Ignacio yesterday was talking about a preference for harmonized tariffs. But I was interested to hear other panelists talk a little bit about kind of obviously a preference for cost reflective tariffs, but obviously cost reflective for who. So I think that's definitely still obviously a point of discussion, and no doubt we'll touch on it this afternoon. And then kind of comprehensive protections, I would say, for stakeholders, consumer protection, technical standards, developer protections, arrival of the grid provisions, and I've skipped one, which is linked to tariff, which is at this point around subsidization models. How do those work, and that they are long-term and sustainable. So those are really, I would say, kind of the 5 points that I've picked up through the course of the conversation. But having identified, I think, those principles, the greater challenge is, of course, how to turn those into on-the-ground realities. And I would say it's pretty obvious from the conversation that we've had that there is still quite a bit of uncertainty as to kind of what the best approaches are for each of these areas. I think there's still considerable uncertainty about a preference for top-down versus bottom-up approaches, noting that neither has really kind of yielded pipelines of projects at the scale that I think we all want to see. In the case of subsidies, long-term OPEX subsidies are maybe ideologically the right way to set about it, and maybe are more reflective of, if you like, kind of traditional electrification subsidies. But few country governments today, I think, have the financial structural capabilities to do that for the mini-grid market. And certainly DFIs, and I speak for AFDB in that sense, you know, have a definite preference for upfront bullet subsidies because they're so much more easy to size and so much more easy to administer. So we're speaking to 3 panelists today, each representing an organization that's heavily involved in and authoring, I would say, the delivery of some major green mini-grid support programs to try and understand how they view sustainability and how they view scalability and how they're trying to embed it into their programs and the offerings that they're giving. So we're going to hear about their projects, and hopefully that will start to point us to in the direction, I think, of some common actions that are being used in order to try and catalyze sustainable business models in green mini-grids. And I'm hoping that we're going to hear a little bit about kind of, you know, standardized approaches to regulation support, standardized approaches to business models, to how to approach tariff, how to approach subsidization. So let's kind of hear, hopefully, some practical examples. So enough talking from me. I am going to therefore ask each of the 3 panelists as a scene setter to introduce themselves and really to kind of answer, I would say, kind of a 2-part question. To what degree through your support work have you identified what you believe to be a sustainable or scalable business model? And how would you characterize it? What does that look like for you? And therefore, through your program, how are you trying to make that a reality? So I'm going to left to right on my screen, as it happens. Temitope, you are first. So over to you, Temitope.
Lucky me. Thank you, Benjamin. So I've been listening on all the conversations yesterday on like market-based approaches, concession approaches, a top-down approach, bottom-up approach. I'm going to take a step back a little bit from that because we're working on framework and regulation, right? So over the past 13 years, we've had so much experience on mini-grid frameworks and regulations. And through that experience, we've seen that there's no one-size framework or one-size model or business model that provides all the answers. We're seeing in some countries like Nigeria, like Sierra Leone, like Uganda, that there are public-private partnerships, but with a higher degree of private sector interaction, you know, and it's more private sector driven. We're seeing countries like Senegal where it's still working, but there's public sector ownership models with a focus on private sector operations. And then we're seeing in countries like Kenya and Ethiopia, where depending on what type of mini-grid is being deployed, there's a mix of both approaches. So regardless of these approaches, is more concretely ensuring that the framework that is developed are implementable and can also be incorporated into funding mechanisms, and where necessary, especially with private sector driven models, can be incorporated into the due diligence process of investors. And in a nutshell, this is what we're doing at Get Transform. We're supporting stakeholders, hosts, countries, government partners in developing the frameworks and then the market incentives that can unlock the markets and not impede business models or scalability. And then when it comes to the private sector driven model, you see that's when the question of top-down, bottom-up approaches then come in. But what is important for framework is that it doesn't impede the bankability of the project. So bankability simply meaning whatever the arrangements of the project, an investor sees it and is like, yeah, I can get my money back from this project. And then taking that overarching view and then going to address 2 issues, one on sustainability and the impact of planning on sustainability, and one on scalability. So we've always known that the space for mini grids is where the lowest unsubsidized costs when compared to grid extension or standalone systems is. But however, based on our ongoing experience over the past few years, it's becoming clearer that there is a difference and there needs to be a differentiation between bankable mini grids and mini grids that can reach last mile solutions. And I like William Brent's in horsepower, even going further to divide it into viable mini grids, bridging mini grids, and then those mini grids that reach last mile solutions. And when we're looking at site identification, I think there's a tendency to bundle all this together and then figure it out after, once site assessment and feasibility has been done. And we need to take a step back into electrification planning. We need to start adjusting the methodology for planning to already incorporate what type of business model is going to be implemented. And we also need to be aware that you can't do a one-off electrification planning. It can't be static. It has to be updated with data. It has to be updated with experiences. And that impacts the least cost planning results and site selection. And if we're specifically looking at bankable mini grids, we need to, usually the parameters to assess for planning is usually community size, population density, distance to the grid topography. But we're learning that we also need to look at ability to pay, peak demand, economies of people within those communities, and the cost of the alternative source of power. So we definitely need to redefine the planning methodology with these parameters. And then whichever approach is then taken, whether it is site-specific tenders or whether it is tenders that allow the private sector to select sites, we've gotten it right from planning and site identification, basically. And at Get Transform, we're also working with ministries. We're working with ministries in developing concrete data management methodologies. And so, like, if you build their capacity to have good data management structures, good monitoring structures, that also improves their capacity for better electricity access planning. And then just briefly on the issue of scalability, I cannot overemphasize the impact that technical standards have on viability. You're looking at how do you maintain standards when you want to ensure that the mini-grid business model is not compromised. You're looking at both the design and construction standards, you're looking at the quality of service standards, and is the constant question of where's that sweet spot between affordability, safety, and reliability. And for each country, it really depends. Again, there's no one size fits all. We have to look at the standards depending on the existing on-grid regulations within the country, the system availability of the mini-grid, installation practices, the existing tariff framework, and then also the impacts that the standards are going to have on the mini-grid tariff framework. And then when it comes to grid interconnection and when the main grid arrives, yeah, I will wrap up now, Benjamin. When it comes to main grid interconnection, sometimes is the expectation that mini grids are already designed to be interconnected to the grid. And that impacts CAPEX, OPEX, and tariff. Yeah, so technical standards is also one of the topics that we're working with. AFOR spoke previously. So we're working with AFOR members on harmonizing technical standards as well. Thanks, Benjamin.
Thanks, Sarita. I'm loving the enthusiasm. So we'll come back to you, I promise. Dennis, over to you. We've heard obviously about kind of regulatory frameworks. We've heard about differentiation between, particularly we've had around a strong site identification, making sure that we're picking the right sites. How is GAP setting about it?
Thank you very much, Ben. My name is Dennis Nderitu. I'm the manager for energy systems based out of Nairobi for GAP. Our organization was formed 1 year ago, or one year ago in a few months, by philanthropists to address market barriers, such as the ones that we have been hearing since yesterday. And what we want to do is to build capacity to enable, for the enabling environment, to attract more investment, and to continue to understand and de-risk the sector for more private investment to flow. We want to support the evaluation of the sustainable business models that we continuously are identifying, and innovation is continuing on that front. And our main goals are increasing access, reducing carbon emissions, and improving livelihoods, which we feel is a good sort of triangular interaction of what actually transitions and access bring to the continent. Partnerships such as ourselves, which consist of a few partners or a good number, just below 20, where AFDB, GIZ, RMI, and a couple of other partners who've been speaking on this forum enable us not to duplicate the efforts that everyone else is doing, so that we are being more complementary in the way we move forward. I think the realities on the ground are pretty clear and have been enumerated since yesterday. That the tariff and the cost of service is something that is really major, and governments do not have, or rather what we are getting from governments is that they don't have enough capacity to be able to subsidize for the entire electrification plan. And this is because of the economic pressure that they're feeling after the pandemic, and also their finances are scattered to so many other sectors like education, health, and so many other needs that people in the countries have. Utilities are also in very poor health. So again, cross-subsidization, which is really something that could work to subsidize connections, is also facing a challenge because utilities really do not have enough cash flow to offload to distributors that are in the rural front for them to be able to subsidize. And I think we are very clear about what private investors want. They want an ROI that is very certain. They want a legal protection that is very certain. So we are very clear on what the sector needs. So we at GIA are looking at this and trying to solve it through 4 levers. The first lever being the enabling environment, which I think is really, really what is needed as a foundation for the continuous takeover of this sector. So we are providing technical capacity to several governments through the development of integrated electrification plants. And again, I think there has been, I cannot say this enough, it needs to be digital, it needs to be flexible, it needs to continuously adapt to the realities on the ground. And we are also making sure, which for us is a very, very special thing, we're making sure that the government and regulators and developers come along with us in all the program design that we are doing, so that we are getting the realities from different lenses and trying to make sure that we can put in as much, as many interventions that can be able to deal with this, the challenges that each sector is facing. The second lever that is a very important one for us is the financing bit, which again, we've been told, and all the developers that have spoken before me have mentioned that, getting to financial close takes a very long time. Getting investors who are ready to come in takes a very long time. So what we are trying to do as an organization is put in the risk capital in, show that these, some models can work. And the hope here is that we continuously attract more capital into these sectors. But I think we need to be very, very realistic and say, investors need to see what the sector has to offer. And the only way to do it is by showing them what it has to offer. So we need to put more projects on the ground. We need to put more innovative models on the ground so that we can really showcase this potential. The third lever for us is the entrepreneurship and business models. I think we cannot overemphasize that, and it's very good that this is the topic of our discussion today, that if the business model is not viable, then there's no way you can attract any sort of financing. It does not become sustainable. So we need to figure out how to do this. One of the projects that we are doing is trying to push for anchor-led, or rather demand-led electrification. We are doing this in Ethiopia through an irrigation-led project where we're doing pilots. Again, we are trying to make sure we can show the opportunity and we can bring the regulators together with us so that they can also continuously amend their regulations to enable an environment where money can come in and where private sector can thrive and the business models can be entrenched or can be supported by policy. So that for us is a huge project that we hope to really learn a lot of variables when it comes to ensuring that we can cross-subsidize tariffs and offer affordable tariffs to households by bringing in a huge anchor load that provides demand, and we charge it not as electricity but as energy services. The last lever that I want to mention is the rapid learning, and I think this is again a very important one. So we need to make sure that we are continuously being as dynamic as possible, continuously changing or tweaking the models on the business side, developer side, on the program design side for us as funders and DFIs, on the governments. We need to make sure that we are creating a platform where we share the intelligence that we are gathering, and that allows us to change so that we still maintain our North Star on the goals that we want to achieve. Because as has been said, I think the goals are pretty clear and we are very aligned on what we want to achieve, but we need to make sure that the platform or the intelligence from which we make our decisions is quite similar across the board, so that all the decisions are being made towards one thing. So us as an alliance, really one of our main jobs is to provide that platform, which is more bringing together sector players, bringing the convenings that are supposed to be done, and making sure that we are speaking the same voice from every lens. And again, this I think is a way to sort of de-risk the sector in itself, because we are spreading the same message to who we hope to attract to bring in more capital and to change the status quo that we've seen so far. I'll stop there and I'll talk about some of these projects as we go along. But thank you very much. Back to you, Ben.
Thanks, Dennis. Thanks very much. Again, I think some very interesting points here around and some consistency here, obviously, around kind of the need for continued enabling environment support. I think we're a long way from having to stop that. Obviously, de-risking capital in order to kind of make those projects commercially viable, to attract that private sector capital. I think we're going to have to come back to that because I think there's a question mark around long-term sustainability and how we kind of evolve towards that. And then I hear your point around rapid learning. But without further ado, over to Raul. Raul, tell us a little bit about kind of what RMI is up to. What are the projects that you're involved? And how is it that you are trying to kind of fight this kind of sustainability and scalability battle?
Thank you so much, Benjamin. I hope you can hear me okay. My connection is a bit choppy. Excellent. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank the African School of Regulation Partnership for bringing RMI to this conversation, and I'm keen to exchange knowledge with my partners in the panel. It's great to see them as well. RMI has been working in this space for 40 years, starting in the US and then taking that experience across the global south, which for us is Africa, small island states, as well as Southeast Asia. I think this is important to mention because there is a significant diversity in how mini-grids actually succeed in different places, and the same diversity you can expect in Africa. This is something that we are seeing in an initiative that RMI is part of in partnership with the United Nations Development Program, also with the African Development Bank. This is the Africa Mini-Grids Program, which is a technical assistance program that receives funding for the Global Environment Facility, and that is taking place in 21 countries across the continent.
Raul, I'm sorry to say, but your connection is choppy indeed, and we're struggling to hear the audio. So I suggest you turn off your video, and then we might hopefully hear your audio a little bit more clearly. Maybe just kick off again with AMP, if that's okay.
Thank you so much. Apologies for this. Can you hear me okay, Benjamin?
I think it's marginally better, so yes. let's go with that.
I think it's better now. Yep.
Thank you so much, Benjamin, and apologies for the connection while I'm on the road. So I was just mentioning that the African Mini-Grids program is an initiative that RMI is partnering with the African Development Bank and the United Nations Development Program to try to scale up mini-grids development across the continent. I think one of the challenges with mini-grids development is that, of course, it's very unique and contextual where they take place. But one of the opportunities of that is that while mini-grid development manifests itself differently across country, or including within a country where I am, like Nigeria right now, there's quite a number of best practices and lessons learned that can be easily replicated so that we don't have to make the same mistake. And I think this is where it is very important to think about partnerships. There are at least 3 types of mini-grid pilots that we are exploring in this initiative. One of them is just greenfield mini-grids, basically complete mini-grid systems that include generation and distribution assets, as well as productive use of equipment, all of them already clean. We also look into hybridized diesel mini-grids because we recognize that some of the systems are already depending on fossil fuels. However, the opportunity for this hybridized approach is to retrofit and try to displace some of the diesel base out of the mini-grids with renewable energy. And then we are exploring different types of productive use overlays, particularly in the agricultural sector. One example that I can draw from where I am right now, which is in Abuja, we had a field visit just now at the Wuse market in Abuja, which is one of the largest markets across the country, and there are like 1,000 markets like this. What is unique about this market is that you have 2,000 businesses that, in the absence of mini-grids, they will be each of them relying on a diesel generator. And so already you have a significant impact in terms of displacing that diesel. However, what is also unique about the way mini-grids are piloted in this market is that instead of looking for business development, business models with each of the 2,000 businesses in the market, what we are doing is actually working with the market association and partnering with the distribution company here, the Abuja Electricity Distribution Company, as well as with developers, so that in partnership we find a solution for the entire market rather than looking at tariffs and business models for each of them. What that allows businesses which are very small to have a little bit of market power. At the same time, the aggregation provides the opportunity for negotiating tariffs that are more competitive. And most importantly, with some of the business models that we apply here, we're looking at prepaid electricity such that there isn't those challenges that sometimes mini-grid developers have with collections. That allows for a sustainable revenue, as well as enabling providing electricity to those businesses that are paying, and avoid the situation that some markets have across the country of commercial and technical losses. This market, which is 2,000 businesses, 1 megawatt in total. And so when you think about the fact that there are 1,000 markets across the country, you already have scalability and replication potential there. However, the challenge is that other markets don't operate the same way. They don't have, some of them, like a market association that can negotiate these tariffs with the utility. They don't have a tripartite agreement between the utility, the developers, as well as the ultimate customers. And this is one of the challenges that we find, but precisely because we see that there are opportunities to replicate this model, then what the Africa Mini-Grids program is allowing to do is to take the experiences in Nigeria to other countries across the continent. Let me stop here. I hope you were able to hear me.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Raul. Definitely all quite a bit better thereafter. Great. Okay, so I'm definitely hearing, obviously, the consistent themes of regulatory approaches coming through in terms of your and my programs, our programs. The point around risk, de-risking capital, tariff approaches, and I think obviously a very important lens which is coming to the fore, which is starting to structure programs around productive uses, and I think we're going to come back to that. I want to pick up on something that Temitope said right at the beginning, and that is that from a perspective of supporting regulatory reform, no one size fits all. Now, I 100% agree with that. That being said, AFDB, I think, is and SIFA has, I think, along with a number of DFIs, been guilty of spending quite a bit of money on consultants who have been seeking to develop kind of regulations bottom up on a country by country approach. And I think too often we've happily kind of, fired out a set of terms of reference, paid for a consultant who has dreamed up a set of regulations, and they've gone on the shelf. I'm increasingly of the opinion that, today as the market matures, we can start to standardize approaches. And I think, IFC SMG has done a sterling job of starting to say, what, a concession contract needs to look like this. And we would encourage people to use it. And I really do subscribe to that view. So increasingly, I think actually the role is around supporting governments to, make the political decisions about site identification, about tariff levels, about subsidies. But once those decisions are taken, the models fall out, the regulatory models fall out, and the contract is what the contract is. Would you agree, Temitope, and how is, or do you disagree, and how is that manifesting itself in the work that you're doing?
I agree 100%. 100%, Benjamin, I agree. But, and this is also why I mentioned, like, I'm so excited about the work that we're doing with the African Forum for Utility Regulators, because you bring regulators together, you give them all the options, because sometimes with that approach you said, sometimes you give them one option and you say, hey, this is the best option, implement. And then, as you said, it sits on the shelf, they don't implement. You give them what the options are. First of all, sometimes some regulators are more advanced than others. Some don't understand what the main building blocks for rural electrification are. You let them know what those blocks are, and then you tackle the blocks individually, whether that is planning and site identification, concession methodology, tariffs, and that is why I'm really excited about the work with AFOR, because it's basically peer-to-peer learning, harmonized advice, and then coming up with those regulatory templates, legal templates, and mechanisms that can then be implemented in country. Another important aspect, I think, is the question of aligning framework and finance. And here, I'm going to touch on a point I think I had yesterday, where is always like regulation is the bad guy in the room. Regulation impedes project development and project deployment. And I'm going to break down why this happens. Okay, so you have a country government. Even if the country government has mini-grid regulations in place, they're consistently trying to strike that balance between number of connections, affordable end user tariffs, sometimes going towards uniform tariffs. And then mini-grid funders have a fixed budget of grants, try to have the highest impacts per dollar of grants, higher connection rates, and sometimes with minimum subsidy targets. Another challenge is also the misalignments between the award mechanism of the regulator and the award mechanism of the mini-grid funder, right? And what concession framework exists in the host country. And so a lot of times you would see that funds are not incorporated into the regulator's licensing framework for applications, site permits, concession awarding. And then only after the funder has awarded the developer is that alignment then done. So, so in summary, we have difference in tariff expectations, difference in site identification expectations, difference in concession processes, and then there's a complete misalignment between the funder and the regulator. And then, of course, this slows down project developments. In this line, we're starting to see that the solution could be through better integrated auction mechanisms. So for example, in Mozambique, we're working with the regulator to design an approach that also includes digitization, but that allows for both top-down approaches and bottom-up approaches. The most important thing is that regardless of the approach that is selected, whether that is bundled, solicited, site-specific tenders, private sector, portfolio, private sector or private tenders where the private sector identifies the sites and brings the portfolio, is that with the regulator, they have clearly defined roles and responsibilities, tools to implement this option, and then there's clarity to the private sector and investors as well. So just to say, Benjamin, that I agree that number one, yes, there is the issue of framework and regulation and standardization, but there's also the issue of ensuring that the funding mechanism works hand in hand with the regulator, and then there's that alignment.
Okay, let's come back to that. I know Raul has to run to catch an aeroplane. Hello?
Yes. Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, Raul. So, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thanks.
Okay, sorry. My Zoom is playing up, but over to you, because I want to ask, through AMP, how is it you guys are doing this support bit? And in particular, you've got AMP is obviously aiming to work in 21 countries, and so how are you trying to
It seems like I'm losing you, Benjamin. I don't know if it's just on my side.
No, I've also lost Benjamin.
No, I think that is everybody.
Okay. Okay, so I mean, maybe I can come in on the basis of the question asked to Temitope, if that's okay. And of course, I mean, there is a trade-off between standardization and adaptation of regulatory policy to the context where you are. And so that's already like a challenge in a way for AMP. Again, we're looking at countries such as Nigeria, which has allowed part of the distribution, the distribution part of the sector is privatized. However, there are other parts of the energy system that remain in government hands or depending on subsidies. At the other side of the spectrum, you do have countries such as Ethiopia, where the government still is very much involved in every single aspect of policy and regulation. And so it's very difficult to come up with one approach for the 21 countries. What we find, and I think this is what is really relevant for the work that we seek to do under the African School of Regulation, is that from the very beginning, regulators are actually not, they don't really have all the information that is required to actually make those regulatory decisions, particularly setting tariffs, understanding how the market evolves. And so in the African Minigrids programs, what we have is 21 national projects that have a standard structure, looking at policy on the one hand, business model innovation, as well as looking at different financial mechanisms. But then that is adapted to the needs of each country. What we have done is at the regional level, we have put together a component that has information sharing and knowledge sharing, which is essentially trying to exchange knowledge on how different regulatory systems work in Africa. And I think the success of this work will deeply rely on partnerships like the African School of Regulation with partners that are able to already exchange that knowledge on the basis of the work on the ground. RMI is not present in every single part of the continent, and we do not need to. What we need to do is connect with those who are based in countries and engage in those regulators who lack that information. And then the second way, which is also a component in the regional project, is through what we call communities of practice. Nothing new in terms of the concept of communities of practice, but what is important about that is that oftentimes there are not spaces or platforms where actual regulators can actually exchange that knowledge and really figure out together how to maneuver that and learn from each other. So oftentimes we think that the regulation needs to follow a particular standard, particularly a non-African standard. And we know that the African context is very different. And when you have and put together in the same room regulators from the continent, then you do develop that trust, that transparency and honesty and candor around the challenges as well as the opportunities that they identify. So that's how we are approaching it.
Thanks, Raul, and thanks for your participation, and feel free to drop off and safe travels. Dennis, noting time, I think we should dive into the productive use question, wholeheartedly. It's obviously something that has come up. I mean, Temitope mentioned it, and Raul mentioned it as well. And I know it's very much at the heart of the DREAM program, which GIAP are funding along with CIFA. So to recap for our audience, the DREAM program is a 9 mini-grid program in Ethiopia, where 80% of the loads will be taken up through irrigation demand. And the idea is that then the commercial loads cross-subsidize the 20% of residential loads. So, I mean, clearly this is a really exciting opportunity to make sure that the tariffs, for residential users are low enough as to kind of meet affordability criteria and even kind of political harmonized tariff requirements. But, to what degree is this model replicable, Dennis? I mean, obviously, Ethiopia has a lovely confluence of factors, which has meant that we've been able to get this program off the ground. Is it a kind of a one-off? And if so, or how do we replicate it? I think that's the key question.
Thank you very much, Ben, for the question. I think, I'll start by a statement, and we need to recognize definitely the future customers for us are rural and low-paying connections without PUE currently, or with very little PUE. So we need to always, as we are thinking about how we are going to electrify them, we need to always bundle this with something that addresses their socioeconomic status. So this is exactly what the DREAM project has been built to do, is to provide electricity that enables farming or enables irrigation, so water and production increases, and communities can earn more from more production, and thus their economic status changes and their ability to pay also increases. So we feel that in a way it's quite circular in the way it's being developed and what the end goal would be. When it comes to the intricacies of the whole design, I think plugging in the PUE load in itself is a way to accomplishes two things. So number one, it de-risks demand, as you've rightly put, that it takes up more than 70% of the energy produced. And that is a very certain demand that a developer can always expect when there is farming going on. And I think number two, it also opens up the opportunity for private players who are not really on the energy space to also see this opportunity. So if I can do pumps and I can supply water, then I see an opportunity to just buy electricity from a rural grid and then sell water as a service to people. As long as that business model works for me, I will be injecting capital that brings to the pumps. And this definitely helps the case for the business model of the developer. I also see there being a huge opportunity on the associated businesses that come out of this. So what DREAM is actually doing is just helping production of agricultural produce. I think agricultural produce at the farm has no value yet. So you need to take it to the market and you need to sell it, you need to store it, you need to do all these activities which are energy reliant. So again, this provides another avenue for funding that has not been going into the energy sector to see the opportunity that is there. And maybe what our expectations is in future, this come as a bundle to communities where there's this confluence of agricultural activity and aggregation and a lot of viable horticultural farming, or even now the subsistence farming maybe could become part of this. I think when it comes to replicating the model, here in Ethiopia, we are looking at it from agriculture and production side. But I think economic activity is not limited to that. And there's there are so many other opportunities. Africa in itself is a huge agricultural nation. And what we have seen from the production of through farmland is, there's a lot of smallholder farmers in other countries where this aggregation is not possible. But definitely there are models that could work for them where we could see this also being something that can be done. I think we have seen companies, organizations in Kenya, such one of them is called Twiga, which tries to aggregate smallholder farmers and put them together and shows them how to leverage the potential of just doing farming together, buying fertilizer and all the other inputs together, and then selling as a block. So I think some are government-led efforts to create this confluence. Others are private sector-led, which is even outside the frame of what we are looking at. And the third bucket that I wanted to look at is other such models that we've seen in other countries where it's not really, there's no really huge push from government to provide a demand area. So the previous speaker, Ricardo and Equatorial Power, have tried such a model in Uganda where they've built a productive hub that is supporting fishing in the area. So building fish drying, they've put in electric boats, they've put in ice making, all of which is supposed to support the value chain for fishing. And this is sort of another scale of the dream model, another way to look at the dream model is the developer themselves, instead of using funding that they might have over and above the capex for their mini grid, they use maybe what I would like to call the need for OPEX subsidy. If you can get that upfront, which I think is the preference for all of us DFIs, is to provide upfront subsidy. If that subsidy can really go into buying or purchasing a productive use equipment, then long-term, the productive use equipment could actually help them recover their OPEX, because if it takes about 40% to 70% demand, that is really enough, I think, to cover the OPEX that they need to do. They need to be doing over time. So I think there are so many models to this demand-led electrification where we advise governments, we advise private sector to really be very keen on site selection and not only look at what is the low-hanging fruit of very good people who can really purchase electricity, but also interventions that can change the socioeconomic status of communities so that viability comes medium term and long term. So yeah, that would be my response, that replication will happen in different ways in different countries. But the vision or what we hope to achieve from this demand-led model is really something that we think we can help scale, and we are looking at it and trying to build around what we have found out so far and all the intricacies and all the data that needs to go into place so that you get it right from the sizing, you get it right from the market assessment, and you understand what you need to do over and above what as a energy sort of specific organization, where your strengths actually lie. What else do you need over and above to make these models work where there is no government support or no support from the sector as is?
Thanks, Dennis. I notice Ignacio has turned on his video, and I think that is therefore the sign that our time is up. I think if we had a little bit more time, I'd be tempted to ask the question, whose responsibility is it to find these replicable productive use models? Can we do it from a top-down perspective, or arguably actually is the private sector much better suited to identifying and seeking out those individual opportunities and bringing those to market? I tend to probably think the latter, but I think that's probably another debate for another time. Ignacio, the floor is yours.
Well, this is just to close the session today. Lots of very useful, powerful insights. And we have still a third day tomorrow to kind of wrap up and take stock of what we have been discussed in the days 1 and 2 and see what we have learned and how to proceed in the future. So thank you very much. I have enjoyed immensely listening to the 3 panels, and thank you all, and see you tomorrow.